Hello, and welcome to the screencast teacher seminar for Unit 10, question number 5 in our study guide on the progressive goal of fixing social problems. We're going to read that section of the book and answer the following questions. List 3 health dangers that were happening in Minnesota. List at least 3 ways the State Board of Health improved the health of Minnesotans. Explain the William Hazel discrimination court case. And then the last question in this section is list a minimum of 3 ways that Amanda and Thomas Lyles helped other African Americans in Minnesota. All right, so let's get into the book here. Progressive goal, fixing social problems. Minnesotans in the late 1800s faced a wide variety of social problems that often seemed beyond their control. Progressive reformers attacked these problems by demanding government action. To increase their social and political power, the reformers banded together. Health dangers. All right, so we'll be answering these first 2 questions in this section here. Minnesota was a national leader when it created the Minnesota State Board of Health in 1872. It was the 3rd U.S. state to create a board to oversee public health services statewide. Despite this fact, Minnesota's reformers in the late 1800s and 1900s saw threats to public health nearly everywhere they looked. Reformers were especially concerned about public health in larger cities. Right? So here are the health concerns that you're going to be listing. Right? Disease was an increasing concern for people packed into densely populated cities. As cities grew, crowded living conditions allowed disease to spread more quickly. In cities and towns, women had to lift up their long skirts to avoid dragging them over filthy streets and sidewalks, covered with horse manure and tobacco spit. In the late 1800s, the carcasses of horses, cattle, and hogs. A carcass is a dead body. So the dead bodies of horses, cattle, and hogs and other animals were regularly seen floating in the Mississippi River, the source of drinking water for the city of Minneapolis. In St. Paul, a police officer and his wife lost 3 of their children in one day to typhoid fever. This disease infected people through contaminated or unsafe water. All right, so we can talk about disease spreading through the densely populated area, the filthy streets and sidewalks, the contaminated water of the Mississippi. Those are all things you could be listing there. All right. By the turn of the 20th century, whoops, let me zoom in here. Go back. All right. By the turn of the 20th century, reformers were beginning to make progress. The State Board of Health promoted good sanitation, clean water, and disposal of sewage. The board recommended quarantine or isolation for patients with highly contagious diseases such as smallpox and diphtheria. The board also set up a vaccination program in the 1890s to help prevent smallpox. Right? So these are some of the ways that they helped improve the health of Minnesotans. Okay? So safe disposal of sewage and clean water. So that's good sanitation, right? All right. Quarantining those who are highly contagious and vaccination. The spread of disease remained a problem well into the 1900s, however. This is evident in the flu epidemic of the 1818 and 1819, which killed as many as 10,100 Minnesotans. Reformers and health officials at the state and local level would have continued working hard to improve sanitation to limit the spread of the disease for many years. In addition, both state and federal governments began making laws to improve the quality and safety of food. So here's another way they helped with health. Minnesotans, like other Americans, were buying more food, were buying more and more food that was being processed in factories. People wanted to know that the food they were eating was safe. The State Board of Health supported government regulations for food safety. In 1906, the federal government enacted the Pure Food and Drug Act, along with a new meat inspection law to make sure that Americans' food would be safe. All right, so first 2 questions should be answered. Now we're going to answer the next 2. So this next section is on racial discrimination in Minnesota during this time period, and we're going to talk about that case that is the 3rd question in your study guide. Racial discrimination. In the years following the Civil War, Minnesota had enacted a series of laws designed to protect the rights of all Minnesotans, including African Americans. Even so, the state's growing African American population faced many obstacles and dealt with discrimination. Some employers wouldn't hire them, and some communities wouldn't welcome them as neighbors because they were African American. African Americans responded to this discrimination by taking action. In 1887, African Americans in Twin Cities rallied to support for William Hazel. Hazel was an African American architect who had been refused lodging at a local hotel. With the help of an African American newspaper editor, John Q. Adams, and others, Hazel sued the hotel and won. The judge ordered that the hotel pay him a sum of $25 in damages. That would be about $600 today, so not very much money. And many African Americans were insulted by the award. They believed the hotel should have received a much harder punishment. Many of the same African American leaders who had supported Hazel went on to form the Minnesota chapter of the Protective and Industrial League. This was a national organization designed to promote and protect the rights of African Americans. In the coming years, branches of other national organizations, the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, for example, were also established in Minnesota. In later years, several local African Americans went on to lead some of these national organizations. So when we're talking about the William Hazel case, William Hazel was an African American man who was refused lodging at a hotel. Wanted a room, they wouldn't give him one. He's because he was African American. So he sued the hotel. A judge found the hotel to be guilty and said, "You need to pay this man $25." Great, he won the case, but $25 was, like I said, like about $600 today. Really not a whole lot of money. So some people were kind of insulted by that. Because they thought he should have paid more. All right, last question here about Amanda and Thomas Lyles. They were community activists, people who they were two African Americans who fought for rights for African Americans in Minnesota. Very few African Americans lived in Minnesota when Amanda and Thomas Lyles arrived in St. Paul in 1874. Those who did regularly experienced discrimination as a result of their race. They often were unwelcomed in hotels and restaurants. They were unable to rent or purchase homes in many neighborhoods. Almost from the moment they arrived, Amanda and Thomas Lyles set out to help their fellow African Americans cope with these unfair practices. So I'm going to keep reading. You're going to be writing down what they did to help others, okay? Particularly other African Americans. Upon arrival, Thomas opened a barbershop. Amanda operated her own hairstyling business as well. Thomas entered the real estate business, buying homes that he would rent or sell to other African Americans. Okay, so they started businesses that could be used by African Americans. He also opened the first African American funeral home in Minnesota in 1906. Together, Thomas and Amanda helped fund a church in St. Paul. Amanda served as the church choir director and organist. Amanda Lyles devoted much of her time to important causes. At one time, she was president of the state's organization for Afro-American women's clubs. She called for laws to protect Black people from mobs of angry whites who would lynch or kill African Americans without a trial. She supported the women's suffrage movement. She spoke out against the selling of alcohol. She called for the end to job and housing discrimination. She also raised money to establish a home and school for African American orphans in Chicago. Thomas was an active member of the Republican Party. He is given credit for convincing the mayor of St. Paul to hire the city's first African American policeman in 1881. He also helped launch an African American newspaper and publishing company. When Thomas Lyles died in 1820, Amanda Lyles took over the funeral home business. She successfully ran the Lyles Funeral Home until her death in 1837. So as you can see here, guys, tons of things you could be writing down as ways that they helped other African Americans in Minnesota. All right, so that's question number 5 in the study guide. I hope that helped you understand that a little bit, and we'll see you next time. Bye.